Okay, so let's go ahead and move on and finish by talking about external validity and the role that it plays in psychological research. So, one of the things that I want to mention is that in general, you should be using critical thinking anytime that you are considering articles in the news. I would, for example, mention that in these particular times, there are certain studies that were originally published that have kind of come out as being kind of questionable. I will not mention what those studies are. I'll talk about some different ones instead. So, replication is really important for scientists, but journalists may not necessarily be thinking about that. And part of that is because they may not necessarily have the scientific training that a research scientist might have. And usually we're going to tend to find that they are reporting press releases by the journal or by people at the researcher's university. So for example, this one's kind of personal, but not quite, but it comes from when I was in graduate school. My doctoral advisor had a major study with a bunch of other people in our department that was basically trying to mathematically model different working memory capacities given certain types of probability of occurrence. So, what would working memory look like if something happened with 40% probability or 50% probability or 80% probability? And so they ended up doing this really cool study looking at mathematical modeling and basically saying, we need to add in this parameter that codes for attention, because when you only have a set size of 1, everybody should be getting it right, and they're not getting it right. So I remember this study came out, and it came out in a pretty prestigious journal, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Yes, it is called PNAS for short. And what was really interesting was that there ended up being a press release about it, and it was talked about in like the mainstream news. But here's what it was published as. It was basically, researchers find evidence for a 4-item limit in short-term memory. This paper came out in 2007. That is 6 years after, that's 6 years after my doctoral advisor's major review on a 4-item limit came out. And even that came out 25 years after one of the original studies by Donald Broadbent found that 4-item limits were out. And I remember just being aghast, thinking, that is not what the original study was looking at all. That's your big takeaway? That there's a 4-item limit? Researchers already knew that. So that's one example. Your textbook brings up one that I love, and I actually kind of brought up in in a John Oliver video that I showed you at the beginning of the semester. So this group of researchers led by Bohannon, so Bohannon and colleagues, basically they wanted to see whether or not people would pick up a study. So they looked at a bunch of different variables. They basically plugged in a variety of different variables, and they basically found this one looking at chocolate. So there's a really cool article by Bohannon in Gizmodo from a couple of years back that actually talks about a little bit more about what they did than your book does. So what they basically did is the researchers basically recruited participants from Frankfurt, Germany, basically giving them about €150 for anybody who would go on a diet for about 3 weeks. And basically what they were trying to do was they were trying to look at these open access journals that usually are kind of scam journals. Not every open access journal is a scam. Generally, Frontiers is a really good one. I know there are a few other open access journals that are really good, but a lot of them are trying to make a quick buck off of you. So basically they had about 16 participants that were basically going to go on a diet for about 3 weeks. And basically they were looking at questionnaires, blood tests to look for things like eating disorders, diabetes, and they basically had one of three diet groups. So there was a low carb diet group, there was low carb plus a 1.5 ounce bar of dark chocolate, and a control group that were basically told to make no changes. They had to weigh themselves every single day, and then they got more questionnaires and blood tests. And so basically, they took this to a financial analyst to basically do the analyses. And what they basically find is that the people on the low carb diet plus chocolate lost weight 10% faster. The chocolate group had better cholesterol readings, higher scores on well-being. But here's the catch. Generally, and Bohannon kind of mentions this in the article. I'm going to kind of quote it to you. Here's a dirty little science secret. If you measure a large number of things about a small number of people, you are almost guaranteed to get a statistically significant result. Remember that we want to try to avoid small sample sizes where we can. That's my commentary. Here's the rest of what he says. Our study included 18 different measurements: weight, cholesterol, sodium, blood protein levels, sleep quality, well-being from 15 people. That study design is a recipe for basically false positives. So they didn't report anything that they didn't get a statistically significant effect on. They made sure that they had small sample sizes. With 15 people, that's basically 5 people per group, which means you're more prone to things like outliers, which could manifest themselves as statistically significant findings. And so basically what they did was they shopped this off to a scammy open access for-profit journal, basically saying chocolate can help you lose weight. And what basically ended up happening is that the mainstream media kind of ran with it. Here are a couple of different headlines from the Gizmodo article, and I'm going to read these headlines to you. Pass the Easter egg. New study reveals that eating chocolate doesn't affect your body mass index and can even help you lose weight. Here's another one. Why you must eat chocolate daily. So magazines picked this up. News stories picked this up. And here's the thing. I am not saying... I disappeared there for a minute. I am not saying to not trust the media. I am saying journalists are not necessarily trained in science. Keep that in mind. Good science journalists are going to consider the context and the history of research in a given field. So if somebody had brought this Bohannon study and said, hey, chocolate accelerates weight loss, a good science journalist is probably going to look at other incidences where this may actually be true. And if they don't find anything, they're going to be skeptical about it. So always use critical thinking skills. Does a study actually need to have external validity to be important? So what do we mean by external validity? We mean generalizing to other participants or generalizing to other settings. So the question is, do these findings have to generalize to a lot of people to be considered valid? And does the research need to be in a real-world setting? So let's first talk about generalizing to other participants. Now, your book kind of brings this up, and I think it's worth repeating here as well. How your participants are selected may be more important than sample size itself. Your sample size may be very, very large, but if you did not draw it from a random sample of your population of interest, then that sample means nothing. And one thing that I would bring up, and I think your textbook does a good job of mentioning this too, your population of interest may not be the general population of everybody in the world. It might be the population of students attending an all-women's college. It could be your population could be people in Midwestern small rural towns or things like that. Your population does not have to be the population, and that's okay. The other thing that I would remind you is that even if you have a convenience sample that has some members of your population of interest, just because it has some people doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to generalize. Remember that your best bet, if you want to make sure that your results do generalize, is by getting that simple random sample of that population of interest where you can, and not just getting a convenience sample. Now, what about generalizing to other settings? Generally, we are going to find that the closer a study is to the real world, the more ecological validity it has. For example, a lot of the studies that I do involve looking at colored squares on a computer screen. We've even tried to fool children into being like, it's like a video game. And the children come out going, that wasn't like a video game. A lot of the kind of studies that I do are looking at very basic processes and thus don't really look like what you or I would do in our everyday life. Having said that, though, just because a study doesn't look like real life doesn't mean it can't be engaging in some way. There are many laboratory studies that can be very emotionally or mentally engaging, like studies that look at placebo effects. And this is what's known as experimental realism. And if you are psychologically engaged in the experiment, what's more important than that the study looks like the real world is that people are responding in ways that they would respond in the real world. That's way more important than whether or not your study actually looks like the real world. Now, here's a really important concept, and I think your book does a really good job with this. Depending on the type of study you're doing and what your goals are, having a generalizable sample or a generalizable setting may not be your top priority. And so the question is, are you testing a theory? Or are you trying to generalize? So for example, if you're making a frequency claim, if you want to know how often people in the United States eat fruit every day, you need to be able to make a generalization claim. If you're looking at frequency, you have to generalize that data. If you're making like a correlational claim or a cause-effect claim, like in an experiment, that may not matter as much if you're just testing a theory. If you're testing a theory, your goals are going to be different than if you're trying to generalize to the larger population. So your book talks quite a bit about the concept of theory testing mode versus generalization mode. And generally what we're going to find is that if you are wanting to generalize to the larger population, if you're looking at cross-cultural studies or different demographic groups and you want to be able to generalize, you're going to be in generalization mode, and it's far more important for your study to have external validity as a result. So theory testing mode, your book comes up with a couple of different examples. So for example, Harry Harlow's research on contact comfort theory would certainly qualify as theory testing. So if we're trying to look at how a mother bonds with an infant, what's more important to developing that bond? Is it making sure that the child gets all the nutrition that it needs, kind of the cupboard mother theory, or is contact comfort, touching your child, hugging your child, snuggling and being close to your child, is that going to develop that bond? And so he tested this with a group of monkeys that clearly were not all populations of monkeys. And additionally, he's extrapolating this to humans. Monkeys are not humans, but this is definitely a case where the results, he's not really interested in generalizing here, but it's a case of theory testing mode. Parents as grammar coaches, this notion that comes from behaviorism that children learn how to use proper grammar through reinforcement has also been tested with theory testing mode. Back in the 1960s and the 1970s, people would look at groups of parents who were willing to basically be recorded as they interacted with their children in various situations where they could correct their language. Many of these parents were, for example, in Boston, relatively middle class, pretty well-to-do, and generally we do find that for the most part, parents that tend to want their children to participate in studies, they do tend to be a little bit more educated. They tend to be a little bit more interested in research. They value research. And that might be fundamentally different from all other possible parents around the world. But they're not interested in generalizing, they're testing a theory. Do parents correct children's grammar? Do children learn proper grammar through reinforcement? And what they basically found is that parents aren't really interested in correcting children's grammar. Children learn correct grammar with or without parents coaching them. And it's kind of clear too that we learn aspects related to language not through reinforcement, but through other means. Now, compare that to generalization mode. If you're making a claim about frequency or how often people in a population do something, you absolutely are in generalization mode. So if you're making frequency claims, if you're doing surveys, if you want to know how often the population does something or what percentage of the population does something, you absolutely need to make sure that your population generalizes. For association and causal claims, you may be in theory testing mode, but you may also be in generalization mode. So one example of how this really comes into play is cultural psychology. This is a really special case where we're trying to figure out if the findings that we tend to take for granted here in the Western Hemisphere actually hold up in other countries. So what you're looking at here is the Muller-Lyer illusion. This is basically the finding that when people are asked to view and judge the lengths of these two line segments, here, most people will tend to say that B looks longer than A, despite the fact that these vertical lines are exactly the same length. These outer angles tend to give a perception of length that is not otherwise there. It turns out that the Muller-Lyer illusion really only works in places where you're used to seeing carpentered spaces that have these kind of corners and these kind of angles. So generally, when researchers have looked at different areas of the world with the Muller-Lyer illusion, generally what we find is that it holds up when researchers do research in places like Illinois, but if we go to other countries or if we go to other if we look at other groups of people, we tend to find that that effect drops dramatically. Another example comes from research that people did looking at North Americans and Japanese participants. So they show pictures of fish against this background. Generally, North Americans are more likely to notice the fish first. They actually reported that Japanese participants are more likely to be looking at the background. In this particular case, they would show items with the original background, no background, or novel background, and by and large, when the Japanese participants were really it kind of shows they were paying more attention to the background and using that to identify these other objects in the figure, because when you change from the original background to no background to a novel background, you can see the Japanese performance drop dramatically. In contrast, the North Americans tend to do best either with the original background or no background at all. So we take some of these findings for granted. Some of these findings that we take as gospel do not necessarily generalize. And this is my reminder to you that psychology participants are weird. Most research on psychology has been conducted on North American college students who are Western, educated, from industrialized nations that are rich and democratic. Now, this is not necessarily an issue if your research is in theory testing mode. Most of the studies that I've done are theory testing mode. I'm looking at college students where their cognitive abilities are probably going to be at their peak. If I'm looking at kids or older adults, I'm probably going to see a little bit of a difference, but I won't know that unless I test those other samples. So finally, let's talk a little bit about generalization mode and the real world. External validity is going to be a lot more important when you're in generalization mode because the goal is to generalize. So having a representative sample is really the most critical thing that you need. Ecological validity is also going to be important anytime that you are trying to generalize your findings to a non-laboratory setting. So your book has a couple of good examples of things that you should think about. When you're in theory testing mode, external validity and real-world applicability are not as important. So think critically, be aware of these differences. So when you're reading studies, think of, was this finding replicated? This is a single study. How does this fit with the broader picture versus, ooh, look at this finding about chocolate helping you lose weight. Don't say, I don't think this study is important because the methods had nothing to do with the real world. A lot of the studies that I do are probably not important in that respect. But rather, consider the fact that they might have been in theory testing mode. And so think about how that fits with the theory they're trying to test. Don't say, I reject this study because it didn't use a random sample. They only used North Americans. Think about whether or not it was conducted in generalization or theory testing mode and adjust your conclusions accordingly. They used thousands of participants. It must have great external validity. Not necessarily. Think about how they got that sample and whether it was representative of that larger population. That psychological principle seems so basic, I'm sure it's universal. Would it hold up? Don't say that. Even I have to be very careful about saying that. I'm like, 4-item limit, it's universal. No, it isn't. Kids don't have a 4-item limit. Older adults don't have a 4-item limit. And I have a feeling if I didn't test on North Americans, I might potentially find something different. So ask yourself, would this hold up in another cultural context, or would it hold up in other settings? Always keep that critical thinking hat on. So folks, this is it. This is our last lecture of the semester. So remember that next week is writing week, no lectures. I thought I'd finish with a picture of your favorite teaching assistant, and he misses seeing you so much. And by he, I also mean me. So I wish you the best of luck working on your papers and with classes and finals. I miss you. Smedley misses you. And I can't wait to read the papers that you come up with. And I hope you have a wonderful summer if I don't talk to you soon. And I hope to see you in the fall. Bye, folks.